Hey everybody, welcome back to another edition of What You're Reading. People ask me all the time, what are you reading? When you're not writing, what are you reading? And for pleasure, for research, for distraction, whatever. This week we have kind of a mixed bag. First up, The Godless Breed by Gordon D. Sheriffs. I read this in the original gold medal paperback because I'm a freak. I like reading these things, reading these books in the way they were first presented. Call me nostalgic, whatever. I believe these are reprinted in more current editions that you can find cheaper on Amazon. I don't know. I don't know about you, but I keep a book in the car. This was my car book for a couple of weeks. Whenever I had to go to an appointment or had some spare time, or maybe sit out in front of the Wawa and have a few sips of coffee and read a few chapters. But this was my car book for a while, and I finished it. And it's an excellent. Gordon D. Sheriffs wrote with tremendous authority. Generally, his stories are set in the American Southwest. This one takes place in northern Mexico. It features Lee Hunter, a gunslinger and adventurer and treasure hunter, who runs into trouble with the law south of the border and is offered the choice of either hanging or helping the local padres find a missing statue of the Virgin Mary. This has been missing for a long time. It was stolen by a Yaqui Indian cult and hidden somewhere in a village or somewhere in some sanctuary far to the south in central Mexico. And Lee and another guy that he's hooked up with, who he can't trust for a second, go off hunting this thing. And it's typical Gordon D. Sheriffs, like I said, written with an enormous amount of authority. As Lee and Jack Priest, his reluctant partner or unwanted partner, head down into a territory that's dangerous because there's bandits, there's rurales, there's Apaches, there's Yaqui Indians. I mean, everywhere you turn, there's danger. And they're up against a clan of Mexican landowners who run this cult and are protecting this statue of the Virgin Mary. And Lee has to not only fight his way to this sanctuary, but he has to find it. The statue is cleverly hidden within a Mexican village largely populated by killers. So it's typical Gordon D. Sheriffs, rising stakes, terrific dialogue, terrific language, fast-paced action. Check it out. If you like a briskly written Western action story with a feel of authenticity, you can't do better than Gordon D. Sheriffs. Okay, another thing, I had the complete Peanuts collection from Fantagraphics, the black and white one and everything else, but I decided to splurge and buy a few volumes of the larger editions that reprint the Sunday strips. And I'm glad I did. And I started with this one. It's volume 3. It covers 1961 to 1965. And this is the period where, as a kid, I discovered Peanuts. I discovered it in a newspaper, and then also in the Signet paperbacks, which were everywhere. Everywhere you went, there were Peanuts paperbacks, and I had stacks of them, and I would read them and reread them and reread them. I just was a huge fan of this strip, still am. I think it's absolutely brilliant. It's one of the greatest American comic strips of all time. Unique in the fact that the creator, Charles Schulz, worked on every single strip over almost 18,000 daily and Sunday strips over a 50-year period. Never had a co-writer, never had an art assistant. Did every strip by hand himself, even though he became, a billionaire off of this franchise and one of the highest paid entertainers of all time. What we see here is the strip evolving and changing, and even more reflecting Schultz's personality. Peanuts was a very, very personal statement. Even though it was about little kids, They and even though it so wonderfully presents the secret life of children, these kids were far more articulate and well spoken than any kids you would ever want to meet. Uh, I, I learned a lot from the strip about how to talk and how to articulate, and not to be afraid to be a little bit, elevated in my vocabulary. And but the strip is, in a lot of cases, therapy for Schulz. He's working through. He had a lot of tragedy in his life, childhood, sensitive guy, later diagnosed to be manic depressive. Not the happiest life, despite his enormous success. Not the happiest life, and it seems like the only time he was happy was at the drawing board, and basically bearing his soul through his avatar, Charlie Brown. And as I suspect more and more as the strip went on, Linus also was a different side of Schulz. And in these Sunday strips, we begin to see Linus emerging more as a character. He's ascendant. He's taking center stage. I think half of the Sunday strips in this book feature Linus quite prominently. And this is in the part of the run of Peanuts where Linus gets lazy eye. I remember that vividly when I was a kid, and has to wear glasses. And we see more and more of his interactions with his sister, who also is ascendant in these years, who takes up, she's either interacting with Linus or she's interacting with Charlie Brown for probably the bulk of the strips in this book. And Schulz is playing with the dynamics of these characters, and they never vary. It's just, whether Lucy is interacting with Snoopy, Linus, Charlie Brown, or Schroeder, she remains consistent. She's an amazingly nuanced character, as is Linus, as is Charlie Brown, as are all the core characters here. And this really is where this strip begins to emerge as a major part of American pop culture. These are the strips that appear just before the debut of the very first Charlie Brown television special. And a lot of the material in these strips appears in that first special, Charlie Brown's Christmas, including, the famous sequence where Linus has to recite a verse from the Bible as part of a school presentation, and things like that. The first appearances of Lucy with her psychiatric booth and things like that. Also, these are the years in which Snoopy takes on the persona of the World War I flying ace, which really it's like a chicken or the egg thing. I don't know what. It's really peculiar, and people who were alive at the time will remember this, and it's never really talked about. But in the mid-'60s, it was this peculiar nostalgia or reminiscence or fad for everything about World War I, particularly the war in the air. And I don't know if Snoopy set this off or the film The Blue Max set this off, which was a huge hit. But suddenly, World War I aviation was like this thing. I mean, there was toys and board games and movies and books and everything else about World War I. Kind of crazy. But anyway, I mean, it just shows or is an example of the impact that, this simple little comic strip about children, Peanuts, had on pop culture. That, Snoopy became a phenomenon. He was everywhere. And this would lead to the years like in the late 60s, where there was a period where Schulz was responsible for the number one special on television, number one show on television, the number one book on the New York Times bestseller list, the number one Broadway play, and even a top charting album of songs based on Snoopy and the Red Baron. So, I mean, he became, in later years, all the way into the 80s, when they would list the wealthiest entertainers in entertainment, Charles Schulz always ranked like 2 or 3. I mean, he was up there with the biggest names, the biggest moneymakers, because he had such an impact on the culture. And really, this book of Sundays 61 to 65 is this is where it starts. This is where, and it's fascinating to read. And even though I've read these strips countless times. Of course, I haven't read them in a long time. I still laughed. I mean, still of them are very, very funny, and then others are touching, without being cloying, or without being sentimental. It's whimsy backed up by pathos, and it always works for me. Schulz was a genius. He really was in this world he created. This world based largely on himself, on his own neuroses. And that kind of leads me to the next book. Kat Timpf's book, You Can't Joke About That. Now, I don't buy any of Fox News has a publishing machine. Every one of their hosts and guests, they all got a book to push. And I don't fall for them, because largely it's just transcripted from things they've said on the air, or they've dictated it, or it's just ghost written entirely. I don't buy it. But I wanted to read Kat Timpf's book because she is a writer, and nobody ghost wrote this book. And it's a really, really interesting book because it's part autobiographical, but then it moves into the value of humor in our lives, how we need humor, and then a lot of stuff about free speech, because Kat is a libertarian who I don't always agree with her views, but she's always worth listening to. It's always well thought out. But I do agree with her 1,000% on all of her views on free speech, that free speech must be guarded, even the speech that offends. And Kat talks about when she was a stand-up comic, and she knows what a stand-up comic goes through. And she talks a lot about that and her early life and her trials and tribulations. This poor woman has really been through the ringer, which, if you know anything about comedians, most of them have. Just like Schulz, Charles Schulz drew from his own personal tragedies in life to present the humor in Peanuts. Most stand-up comics, probably with the exception of Jerry Seinfeld, have miserable backgrounds, have horrible things that happen to them in their life, and they use stand-up comic largely as therapy. And as Kat says, not only does a stand-up comic want to make people laugh, but more importantly, they just want to talk. They just want to talk it out in front of an audience. And she's a staunch defender of comedians saying, if it's funny, say it. And that's kind of the, Ricky Gervais has often said that, if it's funny, say it. It doesn't matter if it's offensive to someone, it's funny. And she goes into the, Will Smith, Chris Rock slap thing in a chapter. And she goes, the various protests against free speech on college campuses. I think we're seeing a turnaround in this phase of our societal evolution, or de-evolution in this case. But the battle on university campuses against free speech, which is like the last place on earth you would see people advocating for censorship or banning or burning books, but it's happening. But we're starting to see a turnaround, and she documents a lot of that. And she also goes into some detail in one chapter about Joan Rivers, and she talks about Joan Rivers' success as a comedian, and how Joan Rivers was an inspirational figure to Kat Timpf, because Rivers never guarded her mouth. She said whatever was on her mind, no matter how much trouble it got her in. And not only does Kat give her estimation of Rivers' power and the magic and her personality, but she also talks about the evolution of her comedic style. I never heard this term before, but she said Rivers was at the beginning of what is called confessional comedy, the kind of comedy where the comedian comes out and lays their soul bare to the audience for laughs. And she said that, the pioneer of this was Woody Allen. If you watch Woody Allen's stand-up routines from the late 50s, early 60s, you'll see what she's talking about. He talks about his therapists. He talks about, his failing marriage and things like that. Things that we commonly hear comedians deal with today, but at that time was shocking, new, and fresh, because largely comedians just came out and told jokes. But Woody Allen came out with this narrative about his life, and Joan Rivers follows him doing the same thing. Her trials and tribulations, and Kat puts forward that Joan Rivers was a feminist, although she rejected that term. People would call her a pioneer. They would talk about what she had done and her importance as a female comedian. And Rivers would always push back. She says, it's not about what I've done. I'm still doing what I've done. I never stopped. I'm not a pioneer. I'm still in the trenches. I'm still fighting. And, I'm not a feminist, and I'm not a female comedian. I'm a comedian. And the thing is that it's only important. The only thing that was important to Joan Rivers, and really the only thing important to us as an audience, is that she was funny. Being female or being a minority or any other level of diversity you want to talk about is unimportant in comparison to whether you can do the job or not. The job of a comedian is to make us laugh. And if you can make us laugh, it's obvious from the truly diverse range of comics we have who are popular now. If you can make us laugh, you will be successful. And we really don't care. It's like I say about movies and comics. If your main hero is a badass and we can project ourselves on him as a hero, then who cares what, gender, race, creed, color they are? I mean, I don't care. You don't care. Same thing with our comics. But anyway, Kat's book is really good, really well thought out, and she's an extraordinary writer. She really is. And there's a little bit of behind the scenes stuff about the Gutfeld show she throws in here and there. She does it sparingly because she doesn't want to make the book about that, even though we're all dying of curiosity about what it's like backstage at Gutfeld. But it's a brisk read. A lot of it's funny. A lot of it is frankly horrifying. It's disturbing. I don't want to chase you away from the book, but it's it's a fascinating read from an extraordinarily talented writer and I believe thinker. So there you have it. I promised a mixed bag, and that was it. And I told you what I'm reading. What are you reading? Why don't you read Levon's Scourge? It's the 12th book in my Levon Cade series. Levon deals with issues that began in the second book in this series. So 10 books later, he's finally said, okay, I've had enough. I'm fixing this problem. And of course, we all know, or at least you should know if you read the books, how Levon deals with these problems. Bring body bags and bleach. So anyway, that's it for me. That's what I've been reading. I'll see you next time, and I'll